Welcome back to Only Talk Sports. We talk sports every single day, or at least we try to. I'm Ernst Jeffrey. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another video. Bowl Mania is coming around the corner in a little over a week, and the first bowl game on tap is the Myrtle Beach Bowl between the Georgia Southern Eagles and the Ohio Bobcats. Over the coming weeks, I will be previewing and predicting with WillND every single bowl game that is going to be coming up. But we got to start off with the Myrtle Beach Bowl, and you've got two teams, one from the Sun Belt and one from the MAC, that have had their ups and downs this season. Both teams have some solid quarterbacks. Davis Brin from Georgia Southern, he had 22 touchdowns and 16 interceptions, but he threw for 3,000 yards, and he was 330 for 510, so it was a very pass-heavy offense, very turnover-prone, but sometimes, even though you have all those picks, if you're throwing for a lot of yards and still a lot of touchdowns, it's not too bad. Where if you look at it, the Ohio quarterback, it was a more reserved approach. 11 touchdowns, 5 picks, only 2,207 yards, 195 completions to 307 attempts. So not as much passing for the Ohio Bobcats, but much more efficient on the turnovers. Running game, both running backs were very similar. Jalen White for Georgia Southern, 891 yards and 9 touchdowns, and Sia Bangura for Ohio at 811 yards and 7 touchdowns. But on the receiving stats, Kobe Hood had 917 yards and 5 touchdowns. But unfortunately for the Ohio Bobcats, Miles Cross, who had 617 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns, he is opting out of this bowl game because he's in the transfer portal. He's going to be going to play for another program next season, so that hurts the Ohio Bobcats in that regard. The FBI predictor does give Ohio a 55.3% chance to win and Georgia Southern a 44.7% chance to win, but the betting odds give Georgia Southern the edge with a 3.5-point spread. So people are a bit confused on who to pick here because Ohio's a team that has a 9-3 record and Georgia Southern is 6-6, but the Sun Belt is a better conference than the MAC, so that's probably where the betting odds are saying Georgia Southern's going to win. They have more offense than Ohio, so even though they're 6-6, we're going to back them because the Sun Belt is a better conference and Georgia Southern has played tougher competition. Whereas Ohio, even though they're 9-3, they were in the MAC, which is a weaker league, and their top receiver's not going to be playing in Miles Cross, whereas Georgia Southern, only a long snapper is in the transfer portal. So that definitely helps out Georgia Southern if you are a believer in stronger conferences and Ohio not having one of their better players. Now, if you look at both the schedules for these teams, that also tells a story because Georgia Southern, they started out the year with a 34-0 win over the Citadel. UAB, they did knock off. Then they lost to Wisconsin in the non-conference. Not a bad loss there, even though Wisconsin wasn't the best this year. Still can't expect Georgia Southern to win that one. Ball State, they beat Coastal Carolina, was a good win. They were a solid team this year, and I think that was when they did have Grayson McCall in the lineup. They did lose to James Madison by a lot, but James Madison was really good this year, so much so that their coach went on to become the next head coach of Indiana. Then they beat UL Monroe. Then they knocked off Georgia State, which was another solid win, but lost to Texas State Marshall, Old Dominion, and App State to end the year. So they went on a 4-game losing streak to end the season. That's tough for Georgia Southern. Clay Helton is the head coach, though, the former USC head man. So Clay Helton has a lot of experience as a head coach, and a lot of people still think he is a solid coach overall, even though it did not work out at USC. Other people do not think he's a great coach, and that's why Georgia Southern is not possibly doing better than they could, but that depends on your opinion. I believe Clay Helton's a decent coach. I think he can have some success here, and obviously their offense, even though turnover prone, like I said, with Davis Brin having 16 picks, they can put up points, but you can tell that their defense does struggle in games, as evidenced by their 55-27 loss to App State in the final game of the regular season. If you go over to Ohio, though, in the MAC, they lost to San Diego State week 1. That's not a good loss because the Aztecs had a bad year. Then they got a win over LIU, but then they beat Florida Atlantic on the road. Not a bad win, but Iowa State was their big win. The Cyclones were struggling early in the year before Matt Campbell was able to turn that squad around. That was a big win for them there, getting a win over a Power 5 team. Then they beat Bowling Green, which was a solid win because Bowling Green actually had a good year. Then they beat Kent State, who was one of the worst group of 5 teams. Lost to Northern Illinois. That was a bad loss on the road. Northern Illinois did not have a great year. Then they beat Western Michigan. Then they lost to Miami, Ohio at home. Not a bad loss. Miami, Ohio had a good year, and they won the MAC. Then they beat Buffalo, Central Michigan, and Akron in the year. So all those opponents were not necessarily that great. So it's been very up and down for Ohio this season. Again, the record being better than Georgia Southern looks good on paper and probably will tempt a lot of people to pick the Bobcats over Georgia Southern, but the MAC was not the best this year. It's usually not a strong conference, and it was not strong this year. Tim Albin's their head coach, and he is not as well known of a name as Clay Helton is, but Tim Albin has done a pretty good job turning around Ohio because they were not as good last year. They vastly improved this season, and even though they were in a weak MAC, winning 9 games is still impressive. Not having their top wide receiver is a tough blow as well, but Georgia Southern, if Ohio can force some turnovers and be able to get Davis Brin to throw a couple of picks, then Ohio would possibly have an advantage there. It seemed like their defense was a little bit better than Georgia Southern's as well. You would feel like this is going to be a game that's going to probably be in the 20s and 30s because of the fact Georgia Southern's defense isn't the best. And even though Ohio's is better, Georgia Southern is a pretty good offensive team. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens in this first bowl game of the year. It's always tough to pick these matchups between two teams in small conferences, but me and WillND, we give our best crack at it to see whether we think that Georgia Southern or Ohio will win the 2023 Myrtle Beach Bowl. The Myrtle Beach Bowl. Do you have any thoughts on this game?
Well, Clay Helton, old USC coach, is at Georgia Southern. I missed him, but now I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't know how good Lincoln Riley's actually going to do. Although they did get a new defensive coordinator. I'm going to pick Ohio to win the game, even though the MAC's bad.
I'm going Ohio. I'm going to go with Ohio to win 31-28 over Georgia Southern. There'll probably be some points because a lot of the games I've seen with Georgia Southern this year, they've scored a lot of points. They've been like in the 20s and 30s. So I'll say it'll be a bit of a higher scoring game, but I am going to go with Ohio. Like you said, the MAC's bad, though, so it's kind of tough to really say whether they're, actually decent, whereas like Georgia Southern in the Sun Belt, it's a better league. But I'll go with Ohio as well. Subscribe to the channel if you like sports content. Like this video down below. Comment down below whether you think that Georgia Southern or Ohio will win the 2023 Myrtle Beach Bowl and what you think about me and WillND's pick for the first bowl game of the 2023 bowl season. Follow me on Twitter as well. Link is in the description, and I will see you next time.